Good morning. We are still on the subject of between two worlds. And relax now and try not to follow me too hard mentally. Try to be relaxed and let this impartation just flow through the room without your trying to intercept it. Because I would like you to see the nature of these two worlds. In the world of the natural man, the man who is not under the law of God, neither indeed can be, the human, there is a word I which constitutes that humanhood. You call me Joel and I call me I. And the mistake is that this I that I claim Joel to be has a mind of his own that forms opinions and concepts based on background, family, race, religion, politics, education or lack of it. And because of this, I, Joel, cannot see correctly or hear. And the result is that I look out at you, and instead of having the ability to know you as you are, I immediately form concepts, opinions, judgments of you. And if I were to tell you what they are, you would say, "Oh, that's not me. Oh, you don't know me. I am not like that at all." And so it is that if I could talk to the politicians I don't like and tell them how I see them, they also would say, "Oh, heavens, I'm not like that. My own mother would disown me if I were like that." Yet that is how I, Joel, see them. And you are exactly the same in your humanhood. You are looking out at your friends, your relatives, and your enemies, and you are forming concepts, opinions, beliefs, and actually believing that the world is like that. And it isn't at all. The devil, if we may use that word, is the word I. I, the I that I have called Joel, the I that is formed by prenatal influences and family influences and so forth. Now, at a certain period of your spiritual unfoldment, something happens, and you are lifted out of or above that sense of I. And all of a sudden you discover that that I is not there. Because as you look out now, you find that you do not have these judgments or these opinions. All of a sudden you find that that which has been forming judgments and opinions and concepts, that I, is no longer there, is no longer functioning. Well, it does function to a certain extent. Perhaps you still like the same food that you did before, or have the same taste in homes or automobiles. But aside from that, there is a great absence of that I, and all of a sudden you are beginning to see, without having formed the concept, opinion, or theory yourself. You wonder where it comes from. It is in the same way that in this humanhood we have the universal belief of good and evil, our Adam inheritance, and therefore, because of the factors of environment and education, we know that certain things and conditions are evil, destructive, and we know that others are good. When this transition takes place, and this fellow I is absent, all of a sudden you can hear about germs and infection and contagion. You can hear about enemies without reacting to them, because now there is no I entertaining a belief about them or a concept or opinion about them. And the word germ doesn't frighten. The word infection, the word tidal wave, war, bomb, these no longer frighten. And the reason they no longer frighten is there is no I there. And you see, the fear is always caused by the fact of I. I do not want to be sick. I do not want to die. I do not want to be enslaved. I do not want to be limited. And because of this I, Joel, the moment any word is mentioned that is connected with any destructive sense, I begins to protect itself, I begins to fear, I begins to seek for remedies. This has even resulted in the creation of a God. And always remember that it was man who created God. Man who created the image of God that is entertained in this world. It is man seeking some kind of a power that would save me. In the beginning, men worshipped this man-made God, and when it didn't function as was expected, man began to sacrifice to this God, tithe to this God, eventually to fear this God. And all of this, remember, is a man-made creation built in man's own mind for the purpose of perpetuating and protecting that personal sense of I. You discover this when you make the transition, because there is no more I that needs protecting. There is no more I that needs healing or redeeming or saving. There is no more I. There is no more personal sense of self, because now this vision reveals that I am God. I and my Father are one. Thou seest me, thou seest the Father that sent me. There is but one infinite selfhood, one divine I, one infinite being, and I am that. Whether I call myself Joel or whether I call myself by your name, I am still I. And now there is no need of a God to fear, a God to sacrifice to, a God to worship. The only God there is that infinite consciousness, which actually is the intelligence, the substance, the law of all creation. Man, animal, vegetable, mineral. One infinite divine being which manifests itself as your individual being and mine. Therefore, once we perceive the nature of God, we are in another world, a world that was self-created, self-maintained, self-sustained, without any help from man, without any help from the mind of man or the prayers of man. Even the word prayer takes on a new meaning, because prayer now becomes a communion between God the Father and God the Son, God the infinite omnipresence and God the individual selfhood. It is an inner communion which seeks nothing but the abiding in truth, the abiding in the Spirit, the abiding in the law. In this world, You will no longer have opinions and concepts. You will have vision. And this vision declares itself. I do not declare it. I, Joel, I do not think it. It declares itself, and it says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." It says, "Neither do I condemn thee." It says, "Thy sins of ignorance be forgiven thee." It says, "Knowest thou not, I, God, am ever with thee? I, God, will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I am come that thou might have life, and life more abundant. I am the bread, the meat, the wine, the water." And as this impartation flows in you and through you, you realize that this is not being personally said to you alone, that this is God speaking to his beloved Son, which I am, which thou art, which he is, which she is, which it is. In other words, the voice says, "Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine." And it is not speaking to Jew or Gentile. It is not speaking to American or foreigner. It is not speaking to white or black. It is speaking to the beloved Son, which I am, which thou art, universally. And therefore, a relationship is revealed between God the Father and God the Son, or God the Daughter. A universal, divine relationship which never began and will never end. There are no errors and no sins that we could commit as humans that would separate us from the love and the life of God. There is no degree of youth or age, of life or death, that could separate us from the love and the life of God. For now, I, Joel, James, Robert, Mary, Mildred, I and my Father are in a relationship of oneness, indivisible, indestructible, timeless. Since before Abraham was, unto the end of the world. This entire world is revealed to you the moment you are outside or above that personal sense of I, which believes that it has a life separate and apart from God. It believes that it has a life separate and apart from us, from each other, and that we possibly could have an interest separate and apart from each other. You see, in the world of the natural man, I would destroy the life of whoever it is at the moment that I consider an enemy, in order to save my life. But in this other world, where you recognize that I, the Father, and I, the Son, is one, you also recognize that I, the Father, is the I of every individual. Therefore, you lose the capacity even to desire the destruction of anyone else. Well, of course, you realize there is no need for the destruction of anyone else because the I which I am is indestructible. The I which I am is indestructible. It is as indestructible as God. For the I of me and the I of God is one. Not two, just one. The I of me and the I of God is one. And the I of me is as indestructible as the I of God. And therefore, there would not even be the motive to save oneself. And therefore the Master could say, there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for a friend. But remember, the friend is also the brother and sister. And therefore, the friend is also the enemy. Enmity can only exist in a personal sense of I. And that personal sense of I can only exist while we are in the state of the natural man, the man who is not under the law of God, neither indeed can be, because that man, that sense of I, beholds good powers and evil powers, whereas in this other world, in this higher consciousness, I, God, is the substance of all form, and therefore there is no destructive form. Personal sense, based on this personal sense of I, aware only through the 5 physical senses and the thinking mind, judging by appearances, knows good and evil. Through the spiritual faculty of discernment, when we are seeing as I the Father, seeing as I the Son, there is but one world, one universe, one consciousness appearing, manifesting as individual, you and me. Now see what happens. In this world of man, there is an experience called abundance and an experience called lack. Both abundance and lack are based on this belief of a personal selfhood I have or I have not. And the moment you have transcended that personal sense of I, you discover, it is stated so clearly in Scripture, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And here you have completely eliminated my abundance or my lack, because I neither have nor have not. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And then, when we have yielded up both our abundance and our lack, then the Father says to the Son, Son, all that I, the Father, hath is thine. And then there is no more abundance or lack. There is only allness, infinity, completeness. In the same way, with our loves and our hates, our likes and our dislikes, the moment that the personal sense of selfhood has been overcome, we neither love nor hate, we neither like nor dislike. But the wisdom and the love of the Father, which is expressed as the Son, flows freely back and forth between us, so that it is the love of God which is flowing as the love between men and women of the world. Not my love, not thy love. The love of the Father manifest as the love of the Son. And therefore, it is God's love flowing between us. The infinite nature of God's love eliminates hate, envy, jealousy, prejudice, malice, fear. None of these can be overcome. Mark this. You cannot overcome hates, dislikes, distrusts, fears, animosities, jealousies, as long as there is a personal sense of self, as long as you entertain a personal sense of yourself or of me. You cannot overcome these negative qualities of man whose breath is in his nostril. Only by rising into this other world, this higher consciousness, where you recognize that I, the Father, and I, the Son, are one, and that all that the Father hath is mine, only then can you recognize that the selfhood of me is the selfhood of thee. The selfhood of thee is the selfhood of me. And we are one in our divine sonship with God. All that the Father hath belongs to each and every one of us. And this wipes out man whose breath is in his nostril, who eventually must be overcome. Man whose breath is in his nostril, who we are told must die daily, must be reborn of the Spirit. And here you have it. In this recognition of the nature of personal selfhood, you are dying to the personal sense of self, and you are being reborn Each time that you can acknowledge the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, you are dying to the personal sense of selfhood. Each time that you can acknowledge I the Father and I the Son is one, and look out upon all mankind in the same way, you are dying to man whose breath is in his nostril, and you are being reborn of the Spirit. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I the Father will never leave I the Son. And therefore, as we bear consciously in thought, as we abide consciously in this communion, I the Father and I the Son, in this intimate communion of selfhood, of divine being, all that the Father hath clothes me, feeds me, houses me, governs, maintains, sustains. Paul says to pray without ceasing. And this is the one and only way in which it can be done, when prayer is a communion. And when, regardless of what we are doing with our lips or body, we can reserve one tiny part of our consciousness for a constant reminder, I and the Father are one. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And this wipes out all personal sense of self. I therefore have no problem to overcome. No animosities, no jealousies. No weapon that is formed against God can prosper. Then only as I and the Father are one can I say, no weapon that is formed against me can prosper. Since the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and the Lord is this I in the midst of me, this I in the midst of me is the health of my countenance, my fortress, my high tower. I need no external reliance, and I need have no fear of anything external while I have I in the midst of me, while I am abiding in the I in the midst of me, and while I am consciously letting the I in the midst of me abide in me. Whither shall I flee from I? If I mount up to heaven, I am there. If I make my bed in hell, I am there. If I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I am there. For I am come that I might have life, and that I might have life more abundant. And so I abide in the I within me, and I consciously keep that I abiding within me. I in the Father, and the Father in me. one. This is prayer that is not seeking something. This is prayer that is not begging, pleading, demanding. This is the prayer of the recognition of the relationship between I the Father and I the Son. This is the prayer of communion, abiding in the Father and letting the Father abide in me. Then, looking out, I have no personal opinions, because now the I that I am sees truly. Sees no presence apart from God, sees no power apart from God, hears no evil, knows no evil, recognizes God, the divine consciousness, as the selfhood of all being. Prayer has too often been an attempt to bring the spiritual grace of God to humanhood. And this is the reason for unanswered prayer. The attempt to bring the grace of God, the gift of the Spirit, to man whose breath is in his nostril, who is not under the law of God, and neither indeed can be. When prayer is communion, when prayer is a recognition of the nature of God as omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, closer than breathing, then instead of trying to bring the spiritual graces of God to a mortal concept of man, we are actually truly in prayer, in the realization of our spiritual identity. The recognition, the realization, the acknowledgement of our spiritual identity is prayer, and is the prayer that brings the spiritual grace of God to individual experience. Actually, in this prayer, we are surrendering the personal sense of man rather than trying to bring God's grace to the personal sense of man. Remember always, spiritual healing does not mean trying to bring the power of God to a human being. It does not mean trying to bring the infinite riches of God to a poor mortal. It does not mean making of God an employment agency. or a marriage counselor. It really means giving up the personal sense of self, letting it die rather than trying to get God's grace for it, so that the Son of Man, the Son of God, so that the Son of God can be raised up in place of that Son of Man. But the Son of Man may die, and out of that death there take place a resurrection which is the Son of God. All attempts to benefit man whose breath is in his nostril by spiritual means must fail. Man whose breath is in his nostril, the natural man, the creature, must be permitted to die in order that the resurrection take place and the Son of God be raised up where I am, where thou art. Then we no longer have material health or material wealth, but we have spiritual grace. And then we discover how literally true it is that thy grace is my sufficiency. Thy grace is my sufficiency. Thy grace is my bread, meat, wine, and water, clothing, housing, companionships. Thy grace fulfills me. Thy grace is the invisible robe. Thy grace is the robe that makes me invisible to the carnal mind, to world belief, to the mind of man. We hasten the day of our death and resurrection as we consciously remember, and remember, consciously remember, not to judge by appearances, to remember constantly that I am not to judge by what I see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, but that I am to be still and let this inner wisdom reveal to me that which is before me. Then, in that moment of silence, in that moment of ceasing judgment, the inner wisdom says, "This is my beloved child, in whom I am well pleased." This is thy brother, this is thy sister. This is thy selfhood in another form. The moment judgment enters thought, remember that word I, and smile to yourself that you have momentarily allowed the personal sense of I to come in. And then as you pause for a moment, the real I, that I am, takes over and reveals truth. And it does it in so many different ways. If I, Joel, have been fearing a germ, infection, contagion, storms, waves, bombs, then wisdom reveals that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So what have you to fear? The earth is the Lord's. Is there any evil in the earth? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, all that is therein. And you find yourself relaxed. You no longer fear the appearance. This one remembrance is a great healing influence, and it develops healing consciousness. Just to remember that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all that there is in. And fear disappears. Resentment disappears. Anger disappears. And you begin to behold the actual world of God's creating. And you'll see why, when this is further recognized, that the lamb will lie down with the lion. You will understand why it is that metaphysicians have always been able to heal germ diseases. You will understand why metaphysicians have always been able to turn enemies into friends. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all that is therein. Now just see how wonderful the earth is. Only in this way can we really find beauty, harmony in our family lives, in our community lives, in our national and our international lives. Only when we can see and hear through spiritual discernment, this is my beloved Son. White or black, ignorant or wise, these are only distinctions, differences created by the ignorance of believing that there is a selfhood, an I, apart from God. We are constantly living between these two worlds, the world of appearance and the world of spiritual cognition, recognition, awareness. Of course, as we persist in lifting ourselves above the level of man whose breath is in his nostril, we must eventually attain the fullness of the Godhead bodily. We must eventually attain the fullness of God's glory. But until then, each one of us must, by our own dedication and devotion, abide in this inner prayer, this inner communion, until more and more of spiritual grace, of the spiritual robe, descends upon us, until it wholly envelops us. Thank you